So welcome back guys, and in this video we'll look at installing these T-tracks from Banggood on my Workbench. So before getting on with installing the T-tracks, I gave my entire Workbench a couple of coats of Osmo Polyx oil coating. This should keep it hard wearing. Now let's get on with the Banggood T-tracks. So the plan is to run it from across the wall all the way till the edge and also on the flip top part of it. So without further ado, let's start unpacking it. So these T-tracks are aluminium low profile ones. So they are 19 mm wide and 9.5 mm depth. So one of the issues with having this T-track on your 18 mm plywood worktop is that it is a bit thin, right? So when you try to screw it in, the screw will probably come out outside. But we'll solve that later down the video by adding packing pieces. To cut the grooves on the workbench, I'll be using the straight edge guide along with this 1/2 inch router, and I'll be using a 19 mm bit for that. So my plan is to put the T-tracks around 1 inch away from the mitre fence. My reasoning is that with any 2x stocks, you can just butt it up against that and it'll give you a positive stop. And if you're using wider pieces like 4 inch or a piece of plywood, it'll still work. Now with a little bit of wax on the straight edge guide and on the base of my router, I started proceeding with the depth of the cut. Now the depth of the cut is just the height from the straight edge all the way through the 9.5 mm till it touches workbench. I then clamped this piece of MDF as a straight guide, and that was placed like 30 centimeters away from the edge of the workbench. And now it's for the exciting part, that is routing it out. So I did the whole lot in 3 passes. So I covered 9.5 mm in 3 passes, which means each of them were roughly around 3 mm. Took my time and I was careful and I was slow. Anyway, at this part of the routing, when I reached the wall, there wasn't enough space for my fingers to go in. So I clamped the straight edge on this side of the workbench and then just routed it against the outer surface of it. And now for a quick dry fit, just to make sure that everything is working as expected. I wouldn't lie, but this entire process was a bit nerve-wracking. The last thing I want to do is cut through my workbench, which I spent a lot of time in making it. So far so good, so I started routing the other side of the workbench now. And that also went perfectly fine as per my plan. Now a quick cleanup on the rough edges. So I also used a marker just to highlight the top edges of these grooves so that they just blend in normally into the workbench. As mentioned earlier, the screws being 15 mm, they are going to poke out through the workbench. So the plan is to add an auxiliary piece of plywood just underneath where the screws would go, so that gives it more substance to hold. Here I'm using a combination of wood glue and some CA glue. The CA glue is just for instant adhesion and the wood glue is for strength. You can see that within 20 seconds you can actually lift the entire piece just based on the CA glue. This piece which you see over here is actually the flip top part of my miter saw. So I'm just going to reverse it, and that's where the screws are going to go into. And as you would have guessed it, that's where the T-track is going to go on over here. And as Brad Rodriguez from Fix This Build That would say, mistakes were made, and this is one of the 2 mistakes made in this build. So I didn't realize that my fence was actually moving away because I hadn't clamped it in properly. So as you can see, I made a big goof up over here where the router just bit in and moved inwards. So I had 2 options at this time. One is to just flip this entire thing again so that I can use the reverse side of it, or use another piece of plywood. But what I ended up doing is I just filled up the holes and used epoxy to just cover it up. And now for the second mistake. While sanding it, I used an 80 grit paper and I accidentally went through the veneer. Well, that's not much you can do because it's a workbench, so I decided to stick with it. Now there was some gap over here which was really narrow, so I used this CA groove from Starbond, which is black in color. And as an accessory, you got this fine needle end through which you can just about fill that crack. And yes, unlike normal epoxy, within 10 minutes you can sand it down. And that's going to serve me as a reminder to be really careful while using a router. Now moving on, I cut these two pieces of timber which are going to hold this straight edge in place. Now with all the routing over, the next step is to just file off or round off the edges of these T-tracks. And now it's time to pre-drill the track screw holes. So for this, I'm going to use the self-centering bit from Rutlands. And what I did is I punched holes through all the screw holes and then went back with another drill and drilled all the way through. The next step is to attach these pieces of plywood behind the screw holes. This, as explained earlier, is to just give you enough meat so that when you screw the T-track onto your workbench, there's substance underneath it. The concept is similar to what I showed earlier, that is glue and super glue. And with that, I managed to attach all these extra plywood underneath the screw holes. Next step is cutting these T-tracks to size. So you could do this with any ordinary miter saw, and the Evolution one being able to cut through wood, metal and all that, that's the ideal choice. So I just install it over here, made sure it's flush, and then I just screw the whole thing in. And that's it, the T-track is now installed. After going through all the mistakes and all that in the centerpiece, it finally looks kind of okay and I'm really pleased with it. The next step now is to build a DIY T-track stop block. So for this, the main thing is going to be this M6 coach bolt, or rather just the bolt head. And with the bolt head, it won't go in just like that into the T-track. So I just grinded off the edges on both the sides as well as on the top so that it just slides in. Now for the actual stop block, I'm going to use this hardwood, which is sapele. It's recycled from an old dining table, and I've chamfered two of the sides as 45 degrees along with a 90 degree. So the reasoning is that when you're using bigger stocks, you just tilt it in such a way that the 45 degrees facing the workbench, so that if you have any dust and all that, it gets collected over there. And you get super accurate as long as the stock is big. However, if you're using a thinner stock, you just turn it around and have the 90 degrees facing the workbench so that it just butts it up against it. And you get repeatable cuts. The next step is to drill some 8mm holes on the stop block. The actual bolts itself are only 6mm. So if you have a little bit of wiggle room, it helps you in tightening and moving it around. So at the top of it, I'm just going to CA glue some washers over here, and it's just for rigidity and just to make sure that the wood doesn't wear with frequent tightening and all that. And oh yes, make sure that you don't super glue your finger to your workpiece. And now let's see this in action. So you just drive the bolt in from the underside, and on the top it'll get locked onto the T-track with this wing nut. And now all you have to do at this stage is use the holes on the T-track and just drop it in. So these holes are all routed earlier, and it's the perfect size for the bolt head to go in. And now let's do some mock tests. So I use a 2x4, a plywood sheet, and all the other offcuts just to make sure that the stop block doesn't move and it actually stops it. So here I'm going to do some test cuts on the miter saw. So I'm just demonstrating on the left hand side. If you need to cut something to the left hand side of your blade, you butt it up against that stop block. And now if you need to cut something towards the right hand side, you butt that up against the stop block on the right hand side. And now what I'm planning to do is cut a melamine board to two identical pieces of 105 centimeters, and this stop block works perfectly fine for that. I couldn't have been more happier with the accuracy. And now if you're wondering how to cut smaller stalks, you may have seen this in other YouTube videos where you use a sacrificial piece of fence attached to your actual stop block. So my plan is to cut dowels which are 6 centimeters long, and I need quite a few of them, so I just use my stop block again for that. So that's it guys. If you're being here, thank you very much, and if you're not a subscriber, please consider subscribing and let me know what you think down below. Cheers, see you in the next one, bye.